Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Red Dawn by Ramon Decolta. Black Mask, May 1931. Joe Garr, the Little Island detective, waited with killers for the coming of the Red Dawn in Honolulu. This story is a detective noir tale with elements of hard-boiled fiction. It revolves around betrayal, deception, and moral ambiguity. The central character, Joe Garr, a weary detective, becomes embroiled in a tense situation involving violence and a dangerous adversary. The plot explores themes of greed, survival, and the desperation that drives individuals to make morally complex decisions. Barrington regarded Joe Garr with frowning, dark eyes. He was tall, immaculately dressed, fresh-looking. He was the power and brains behind the native Hawaiian police force, and it was very evident that the Philippine Island detective's calm annoyed him. "I strongly advise you to return to your ship, Senor Garr," he said slowly. Joe Garr smiled with his thin, colorless lips. His almond-shaped eyes seemed sleepy, but they were not. And Barrington sensed that. He stretched his long legs, rose from the wicker chair in his office, but he did not move about. He stared down at Joe. 10 extremely valuable diamonds stolen in Manila," he said quietly. "You have got one back, but 9 are missing. You were forced to kill the man from whom you recovered the one on the Cheo Maru. That was unfortunate." Joe Garr nodded his head just a little. "Very unfortunate," he agreed, "but also very necessary." Barrington shrugged. "Perhaps you were too aggressive, Senor Garr," he suggested. Joe Garr smiled a little more broadly. He shook his head very slowly. "I am never aggressive, Senor Barrington," he returned very quietly. "Manila is a city of heat. Heat breeds laziness." The American made a peculiar snorting sound. He turned towards his desk and glanced at the report of the Hawaiian police, made less than a half hour ago, at midnight. Benfeld, Tan Ying, and Dave Chang, all dead. "And you are not aggressive?" Joe Garr shrugged almost casually. Benfeld was the representative of the Dutch company that had insured the diamonds. For some reason, he wished me to stop my search for them and for the thieves who murdered to get them. He attempted to trap me. He used Chang for that purpose, and Chang suffered. The blind Chinese Tan Ying. I am not sure how he was involved. I think there was to have been a meeting at his place. More than one person was concerned in the Manila robbery and murders. Perhaps there was to be a meeting at Ying's place, but Benfeld thought I had been shot to death on the road beyond the city. I upset his plans, and there was sudden death. "Triple death," Barrington said steadily. "You are sure you learned nothing?" Joe Garr rose from his straight-backed chair. He lied impassively. "Nothing. That seems to lead me anywhere," he said. "It is like that street of the lanterns where Ying lived, much color and sound, and so difficult to see or hear beyond either color or sound." Barrington half closed his dark eyes. He said very grimly, "You are known to be in Honolulu, Senor Garr. It is known that you are after the von Loeffler diamonds, and that you seek the murderers of your friend, Juan Aragon, and of that jeweler's son, Delgado. Already there has been death, and dawn is hours away. I should strongly advise." Joe Garr's lips made a clicking sound. "You have already suggested that I return to the Cheo Maru," he said calmly. "It is kind of you to think of my protection. Perhaps I shall accept your advice." Barrington continued to frown. "I hope so," he said. "We will do everything possible here. You will be in San Francisco in 6 days, and I wish you luck." Joe Garr smiled and bowed. They did not shake hands. The Philippine Island detective reached the street and kept his brown right-hand fingers in the right pocket of his light coat. A cool breeze swept from the direction of Pearl Harbor. The streets were almost deserted. The island detective smiled with his almond-shaped eyes almost closed, moved slowly in the direction of the docks. They were not far from the building in which Barrington had his office, and as he walked, with his eyes glancing sharply from the corners, Joe Garr sighed. His stubby fingers tightened on the grip of the automatic in his right coat pocket. "Senor Barrington does not wish more death in Honolulu," he murmured very softly. "He is anxious for my departure. He thinks of my health." Joe's white teeth showed in a swift grin. It faded, and he reached with his left-hand fingers for one of his brown paper cigarettes. The street became suddenly an alley. His eyes caught the slanting masts of ships, their rigging beside the docks. He was 10 feet along the alley when he halted, struck the match. But even as the flare dulled his vision, he saw the shape that slid from the doorway less than 20 yards distant. He heard the swift intake of the short man's breath, saw the right arm go upward and back. The island detective moved his left hand away from his face, let his short body fall forward. As he went down, his right hand shoved the material of his coat pocket ahead of him, started to squeeze the trigger. But there was no hiss of a knife hurled through the air, and no crack sound from his automatic. He relaxed his grip, rocking on his knees, as he watched the figure of the man who had slid from the doorway bend forward. The man's head was held low, his body was almost doubled as he pitched downward. He choked terribly but weakly. There was a sharp crack as his head battered against the broken pavement of the alley. Joe Garr swayed to his feet. He moved back into the darkness of a narrow doorway on the opposite side of the alley from that where the short one had fallen. He waited, his back flattened against a wooden door that did not give, holding his breath. The man who had collapsed made no movement. His head had struck heavily, but Joe knew that he had been unconscious before he had fallen. And yet, when he had slid from the doorway across the alley, his movements had been swift and sure. He had sucked in his breath, drawn back an arm, and Joe was sure there had been a knife in his hand. Minutes passed. There was the faint sound of machines in the direction towards the city center away from the docks. A cool wind rustled some paper down the alley. It was quite dark, and Joe could not see beyond the body of the man. Once he had heard footfalls in the distance, and the sound of high-pitched voices. The alley was on the edge of the Chinese Quarter, perhaps in it. His right forefinger pressed the steel of the automatic trigger. The material of his right pocket was held clear of his side, but he made no movement. 5 minutes passed. Joe Garr shivered a little. He was sure that death had come to the one across the alley from some spot directly behind him, and that the person who had caused the death was waiting silently for some other movement in the narrow alley. He breathed slowly, carefully. His right wrist was aching from the tension of his grip on the automatic, and his eyes moved only from the motionless figure on the pavement to the blackness of the low doorway behind the figure. The shacks along the alley appeared to be closed, deserted, but the entrances existed, and in the one almost opposite him was the human cause of another person's death. Unless, and there did not seem much chance of that, there had been an escape through the shack beyond the motionless, sprawled figure. The island detective listened to the shrill whistle of a small boat beyond the docks. He relaxed his body a little, but suddenly it was tense again. He had heard very distinctly a faint chuckle. It had not come from the doorway in darkness beyond the collapsed figure, but from some spot above him. He raised his head slightly. The shacks were low, less than 15 feet high. Clouds were over a crescent moon. The night had become dark, but he could see nothing on the roof of the shack opposite. And then, very softly and quietly, the voice sounded. It was low and throaty and very calm. "Senor Garr, you are comfortable?" Joe Garr did not move his body. There was a quality to the voice, an accent of grim amusement. He had a definite feeling that he was trapped, that the death of the man across the alley had been a part of the trap. He did not speak. The voice sounded again from above and to the left. The roof of a shack on his left and on his side of the alley held the speaker, he guessed. "You will kindly disarm yourself. Step into the alley, Senor Garr." The island detective raised his automatic higher, withdrew it from the right pocket. He moved only his right arm. The voice said after a short pause, "Do not be a fool, Señor Gar." The accent was clear. He had heard the same accent of precise English in Manila. It was Spanish, this man's native language, and the speaker was calm, very calm. He was sure of himself. Seconds passed. Then the voice said a little more loudly, "See, but very low," and now Jogar heard the steely hiss of the knife. He drew his legs together. The left trouser material just above his ankle was jerked sharply. Wood made a dull sound as the knife blade cut into the door at his left side. His body was rigid. The voice somewhere above said with sharp amusement, "Señor Gar, you are comfortable?" The island detective sighed. The cat played with the mouse, but more wisely than most cats. Jogar reached down, jerked the knife loose from wood and cloth. He tossed it into the alley. Straightening, he said as steadily as he could, "What is it you wish, Señor Mendez?" Again there was the chuckle, and then a short silence. Jogar was thinking, "It is Mendez." Chang said before dying in the shop, "It was Mendez. We met in the Street of the Lanterns. He was coming." That was what Chang had said. Mendez coming to meet someone in Honolulu, perhaps the one in white. The one Joe had been forced to shoot to death on the Cheo Maru, and from whom he had got the one Von Loeffler diamond. But Mendez knew that Joe had killed, and he had trapped him now, and was toying with him, grimly amused. The island detective stood motionless, looking at the body across the alley. The voice from above came quietly, "Kindly disarm yourself. Step into the alley, Señor Gar." Joe sighed again. He bent forward and tossed the automatic into the alley. There was a flashlight beam that picked it up, then faded. Joe stepped from the doorway, moved out a few feet. The voice said, "Face towards the docks." The tone was hard now, sharp. Joe did as directed. He stood for seconds, his eyes slitted, his body slightly relaxed. He expected death at any moment from behind, but it did not come. There were sounds on the roofs of the shacks, sounds behind him, but he did not turn. And then the same hard voice sounded directly behind him. "Go to the alley end, walk slowly. There will be a closed car. Enter it. I shall be near you, and I advise you to be wise." The island detective moved slowly forward. The alley narrowed, then widened. At the dock end there was a small, dirty machine. It was closed, and there was the fat, brown-yellow face of a Chinese faintly lighted by the instrument board light. The man did not turn his head, but a rear door of the machine opened as Joe neared it. The voice, now close behind, said, "Step inside." Joe got into the car. A figure made room for him. The seat had space for three, back of the driver. Joe dropped heavily beside the one already seated. The one who had spoken got in and sat on his right. The interior of the car was very dark, but Joe saw that the man's features were sharp, his face long. He said to the driver in an easy tone, "Yes, and do not go too fast." It was as though everything had been carefully planned. Joe tightened his lips. He was sure that the one on his right was the man known as Mendez, and he was sure that Mendez was hard and extremely clever. He had been followed from the police station to the building in which Barrington had an office, and Mendez had waited. Perhaps something had gone wrong, and there had been a death in the alley, or perhaps nothing had gone wrong, and it had been part of the scheme of things. The man on Joe's right said softly, "It will not take very long, I hope, Señor Gar." Joe smiled a little. He nodded his head. "You are Señor Mendez?" he asked. The man was tall and thin. He had long, slender-shaped hands and wore a dark coat. That much Joe could see as the car moved slowly along the street by the docks. He said, "See, Señor Mendez, there have been words about me." The island detective turned his head towards Mendez. He spoke very steadily. "Chang spoke of you and Tan Ying." The grim quality returned to Mendez's voice again. He spoke very slowly. "And both Ying and Chang are dead. That is too bad." Jogar smiled, showing his white, even teeth. Then his lips pressed together. So many people die for diamonds, he observed. Mendez nodded. His face was turned towards the driver's back. The machine was running slowly out of town. It was not going towards the beach, but through the poorer section of Honolulu. It is so, Mendez agreed. But you are a curious one, Senor Gar. Even so, why the island should you die said for nothing? Diamonds? He tried to keep his body relaxed, but there was a threat in Mendez's words. It was a question that Mendez asked, and yet only half a question. The machine was out of the town now. It was running through the tropical growth, and there was suddenly a moon showing through the clouds. Mendez made a gesture with his long right hand. He said almost cheerfully, "It is pretty, Senor, these warm countries. They make one want to live." The island detective kept his eyes to the front. For almost 5 minutes the car moved at good speed over a road that was fairly smooth. Then it slowed, turned abruptly to the left. The road became narrower. It was of dirt now, and the country was rolling. The moon seemed strangely bright for its size, and the car passed through what appeared to be a pineapple plantation. The one on Joe's left let his body rock with the car motion, but he did not look at the island detective. Mendez made another gesture with his right hand. "It is not unlike the Philippines," he said slowly. "You would like to return someday, Senor Gar?" Again there was the mocking quality in his voice. Joe turned his head, and the two regarded one another. Mendez's skin was a light brown color. His eyes were dark. They were cruel eyes, and intelligent. The man's features were good, but his lips were very thin and the curve of his mouth was barely perceptible. He had a sensitive face, but it was also a brutal face. Joe Gar said steadily, "Yes, I should like to return someday." Mendez nodded. "It will not be difficult for you," he returned. "You are not a fool." The car jerked suddenly off the road. It ran a short distance, scraping foliage. So narrow was the path it traveled. It stopped. The one on Joe's left leaned forward and looked at Mendez, but he did not speak. Mendez said, "That is all, but stay." The door on the left was opened. Mendez said pleasantly, as the one to whom he had spoken descended, "We will leave the machine, Senor. I have a gun in my right hand. There is a small plantation house just beyond the car. Will you walk towards it?" Joe Gar let his eyes widen a little on the dark eyes of the Spaniard. He said quietly, "You can murder me here, just as well, Senor Mendez." For a second he saw sardonic amusement creep into the thin-faced one's eyes. And then a puzzled expression showed, but he knew that Mendez was acting now. "Murder you?" The Spaniard laughed in a chuckling way. "Why do you think of murder, Senor Gar?" The island detective smiled. "Does it seem so strange?" he replied. "After all, you are aware of the von Loeffler diamonds. For them there has been much murder." Mendez nodded, his face suddenly serious. "That is so," he agreed. "But you were not satisfied." Joe Gar's grey-blue eyes showed no expression. "Not satisfied?" he said very tonelessly. Mendez frowned. "At the house we can talk more easily," he said. "Please descend." Joe Gar shrugged. He got from the car, saw the thatch-roofed house through the thin foliage up a slope a short distance. There were windows, but no lights. The house was well protected from even the narrow path. The dirt road was 100 yards or more distant, and the other road perhaps a half-mile. The island detective moved slowly up a path that wound. He heard Mendez instruct the driver to turn the machine and take it down near the dirt road. As he walked slowly up the slope, he heard the engine of the car changing speed. Twice the brakes made a squealing sound. There was no sign of the one who had been seated on his left. He was certain of one thing: Mendez held death for him. Perhaps there was information that the Spaniard wanted first. Perhaps he would make promises. But in the end there would be death. He could read it in the dark eyes, feel it in the cold amusement of Mendez's voice. And it was in the mockery of the Spaniard's words, too. Behind him, he heard the Spaniard's footfalls, very close. He moved slowly, and he was thinking fast. There was a better chance outside, here on the path, than there would be within the thatch-roofed plantation house. If he could take Mendez by surprise, the Spaniard said almost pleasantly, "It is the fine view that Senor Benfeld liked here. The dawn, it is all red, the sun rising from the water." He let his voice die. He was breathing a little heavily now, Jogar said, suddenly stopping and breathing as though with difficulty. "Benfeld tried to kill me, Mendez." He was a representative of the insurance company handling the von Loeffler stones. He thought I would be off my guard because of that. How much was he offered for my death? Mendez said cheerfully, "Enough, Senor Gar." But he was a fool and not careful enough. He knew that you were trained in hunting down people, yet he was careless. Jogar moved slowly up the slope again. He was breathing very heavily, though he was not tired. Behind him he could hear Mendez, and he was sure that the Spaniard was not pretending. He slowed his pace just a little, spoke haltingly. "I will make a bargain with you, Senor Mendez, if you will let me have the chance." He uttered the last word softly, easily, and then, like a cat, he let his body swing around. He leaped at the figure of the man behind, and several feet below him on the path. But even as his short body shot through the air, he knew that he had lost. He saw Mendez's body stiffen. The features of the long, sharp face were twisted into a mask of hate. The Spaniard's body swung to one side. His right hand went up and then came down. Something gleamed dully in it. The first time it struck Joe, a glancing blow on the shoulder. But as his hands and knees hit the earth, it struck him again, in a second chopping motion. Pain streaked across the back of his head. The yellow light of the moon became a curtain of black. He lost consciousness. The room held little furniture, and what there was of it was bamboo. There was a table and 2 chairs, and between the windows a small bookcase. Mendez stood near the bookcase, his back to the wall of the house that was little more than a shack. The lamp on the table had a faulty wick, or the oil was bad. The light was faint and uneven. Shadows were on the walls. Mendez said in a conversational tone, "You are lying, Gar. You have been lying for an hour, and there are few hours left to you. You were successful in the islands, but the Philippines are not like these islands. They are hotter, and the brain of that breed is stupid. You killed a man on the Cheo Maru, and that man had with him 10 diamonds. They were worth more than $200,000. You tell me you found only one of them. You are lying." Jogar slumped in one of the bamboo chairs. Pain stabbed across his head. The gun that Mendez used was a heavy one, and the Spaniard had struck him with a savage motion. There was blood on the island detective's face, and on the fingers of his right hand. He was tired. 3 times in the last hour, Mendez had struck him. Once the one who had sat on his left in the car had struck him. He was a Chinese with a stupid, typical face. He sat in a chair and watched the island detective now, his eyes expressionless. The driver of the car was not in the plantation shack. Joe said thickly, "I have told you the truth, Mendez. From the one in white, the one the Malay spoke of before he died, in Manila, I got only 1 diamond. It was he who told me of the blind Chinese. That was why I went there." Mendez's sharp face held a dull hatred now. It was clear that he did not believe the man who had tried to trick him on the sloping path that led to the plantation shack. Jogar knew that he had lost much in that attempt. But he also knew that from the beginning Mendez had determined to kill. The Spaniard spoke in a cold, emotionless voice. "You're making a mistake, Gar. You've been fortunate for years, but that was with people of mixed descent. Now, it won't matter if I tell you this. You're either lying or 2 others are. On the Cheo Maru, there were 3 individuals who might have had the von Loeffler stones. The man you killed was one of them, but the diamonds weren't split up. One person was supposed to keep them all. You took one from the man you killed, which means you have them all, Gar. Joe Gar shook his head. Only one, he said firmly. How do you know what you claim is the truth? Mendez smiled faintly. I was one of the 3 on the Cheo Maru, he said calmly. I didn't travel first class, and I didn't have the diamonds. The man you killed had all 10 of them. And now, you have them. But they won't help you. The island detective sat up straighter, his voice slow. What about the 3rd person? He watched Mendez's eyes narrow. The Spaniard shook his head. I said either you're lying or 2 others are. I'm one of those 2, and I don't lie. And the other one? She's... Mendez stiffened, a flicker of rage in his eyes. But then, as though he remembered it wouldn't matter, he relaxed and smiled. Joe Gar's eyes widened slightly. A woman? He asked slowly. There was a woman who? His words faded. Mendez smiled coldly and lit a cigarette. It doesn't matter, he said. You've already killed one of the 3 who might have had the diamonds. I'm telling you the truth. I didn't have them. The woman was the other one. You say you have one of the stones. I say you have them all. Joe Gar's voice was thick. Then why did I go to the blind Chinese's shop? Mendez's smile remained. That's simple, he replied. Benfeld, who had told us a lot about the diamonds because he was in Holland when they were insured, needed money from us. He was desperate and tried to have you killed. But his attempt was clumsy, and you grew suspicious. You avoided the danger. Then you knew there was a blind Chinese in Honolulu who was important. You were curious. You had the diamonds, but you wanted the thieves, the killers, and you were lucky until you left Barrington. The island detective shook his head. Mendez was about to make an offer, a final offer, but it wouldn't be an honest one. He couldn't trust Mendez. 3 people had been aboard the Cheo Maru. One was Mendez, another was dead, and the 3rd was a woman. Joe Gar had recovered only 1 diamond. But he believed Mendez in one thing. The Spaniard was convinced that the man Joe Gar killed had had all of them. Joe Gar spoke slowly. I'm telling you the truth, Mendez. 10 diamonds were stolen in Manila. I've recovered only 1. The man I killed didn't have more than that. I believe you, he didn't have any. The woman's tricked you into thinking. Mendez crossed the room and struck him sharply across the face. He took a step back, rage in his eyes. Joe Gar pressed his lips together. Mendez backed away, reaching into his pocket for a gun. His gaze flickered to the Chinese man, who suddenly looked thoughtful. Joe Gar's tongue touched his lips, tasting blood. His mind was sharp despite the blow. Benfeld had given them information that led to the diamonds being traced, revealing their location. 3 had escaped from Manila aboard the Cheo Maru, and one of them was a woman. He hadn't considered the woman. He murmured softly, "It's her, who has the other 9 stones." Somehow, she got them, leaving the man with only own. He stopped when he saw Mendez's eyes narrow at him. The Spaniard's lips curled into a cold smile, but his eyes were filled with hatred. Mendez addressed the Chinese man. You tell driver, no need for him. You take rifle and go where I show. Driver, go back to Honolulu. Keep quiet or it will be bad. You stay with rifle ready. You know what I tell. Much gold for you. Good? The Chinese man grinned, showing red gums. Good, he said, leaving the shack and closing the door behind him. Mendez waited a few minutes before glancing out the window facing east. The shack was on a rise, and the moonlight was brighter now. For you, Mendez said flatly, it will be a red dawn, Gar, one way or another. If you tell me the truth, you'll see the sun rise and return to town. If not, you'll leave this room, and the Chinese with the rifle. He trailed off, then shrugged. Joe Gar sighed. I've told you the truth, he replied. Mendez moved closer and stared down at him. One of Tan Ying's men tried to attack you tonight, Gar, he said slowly. That was out of hatred. He didn't try to knife you because he was injured. I used him to help me. $200,000 is more than I need, Half of that is enough for me. The other half, well, that's for you." Joe Gar stared at him. "And the woman?" he asked slowly. Mendez's muscles twitched and his lips twisted into a smile. "I'll handle her," he said softly. Joe Gar shook his head. "You couldn't. Let me go free, Mendez. If I gave you 5 diamonds, you'd kill me, quickly." Mendez's eyes burned with eagerness. He took a step closer to Joe Gar. "I swear it by the name of—" His words faltered, and a sudden rage replaced his eagerness. Joe Gar slowly shook his head. "I've only recovered 1 stone." Mendez lashed out, striking Joe Gar across the temple with his fist. Joe Gar stumbled, but was quickly knocked back down. He groaned. Mendez moved away from him. There was the sound of a match striking. Joe Gar smelled the scent of a cigarette. He rocked his head from side to side, but didn't look up. Mendez spoke harshly. "You have until dawn. After that, you'll go outside, walking. The man with the rifle is less than 50 yards away. I'll stay inside until I hear the shots. Then he'll leave, after he sees you fall. It's all very simple." Joe Gar raised his head slightly. He wiped red from his face with the back of his right hand. "That will not get you the von Loeffler diamonds." He breathed thickly. Mendez pulled on his cigarette, leaned against a wall of the plantation shack and smiled. "If you go to your death that way, I will believe you," he said. "Then I will know where to look." "But she has never—" Joe Gar tried a grim smile. "She has never lied before," he muttered. "Women are often like that. There must be the first time. And white glass worth thousands is a reason for lies." Mendez pressed his lips tightly together. "You've tricked too many men, Senor Gar," he breathed. "I hate you for that, and I do not believe you. You have the diamonds, 10 of them." Joe Gar raised his eyes. Suddenly his body stiffened. He said weakly, "I do not think they are worth it, but 5, that is too many to give. I will give you 3. Mendez dropped his cigarette and crushed it with his shoe sole. He took rapid steps to Joe's side. His eyes were shining. "You will give 5, he snapped. The island detective stared at him stupidly, but he shook his head from side to side. Mendez swore and struck at him savagely. The island detective let his head fall low. He closed his eyes. Mendez struck him again, then moved across the room. "By dawn," he muttered hoarsely, "you will give me the 5. Joe Gar said weakly, his eyes expressionless. "And what proof have I that you will let me go away from here safely?" Mendez shrugged his shoulders. He was confident of winning. He felt that Joe was breaking down. It had been a long night. 10 diamonds, perfect and of large carat. $200,000. The island detective could read his thoughts. He was so sure of winning, so sure the man in the chair before him possessed the diamonds. And the third. Joe was thinking of the 3 who had held up the Delgado jewelry store in Manila, and one of those responsible for the death of his friend, Juan Aragon. She would be one of many women aboard the Cheo Maru, which would leave Honolulu for San Francisco at noon, but he knew that he would not be aboard the boat that had brought him from Manila. Mendez would see to that. The Mendez who stood before him now, mocking and battering him. The Mendez who was convinced that he had the 10 von Loeffler diamonds, and who had already told him too much. Red Dawn, the Spaniard had said. There had been a mockery in those words too. His lips shaped themselves into a bitter smile as he remembered the advice that Barrington had given him, advice to return to the Cheo Maru. Mendez said very slowly, "Well, there is an end to this, Gar. I will give you 5 minutes. The sun is getting up. I have much to do. If you swear to me." Joe Gar got unsteadily to his feet. Mendez regarded him with a twisted smile. The island detective was unarmed and very weak, and once before tonight he had failed to surprise the Spaniard. Mendez said grimly, "Steady, you are not accustomed to being knocked around," the island detective said thickly. "I do not want to die, Mendez. I will tell you the truth. But you must swear to me that I will go free." Mendez's eyes showed eagerness again, but the next second they had narrowed and held a hard expression. "I swear to you that you will go free if you tell me where the diamonds are." Jogar nodded his head. He knew that no matter what he said, he would not go free. He raised his head and looked Mendez squarely in the eyes with his bloodshot ones. "The boat," he said steadily, softly. "I got them from the one on the boat. I have had them with me, on me, but in the car it seemed very bad. I was afraid. I had them in one of my Manila cigarette packages mixed with a few cigarettes." He paused, swayed a little. Mendez stepped in very close to him. His voice was shaking. "In your cigarette package," he breathed fiercely. "You had them." Jogar nodded as Mendez's voice died. He said weakly, brokenly, "The Chinese on my left." He had a sack-like coat. I slipped the cigarette package in a pocket, his right pocket. Mendez swore sharply. He muttered angrily, "The Chinese." His body swung away from Jogar instinctively. His fingers clutched at the knob of the door that opened on the path, and then suddenly he remembered. There was the rifle. His body started to turn, but even as he threw up his arms in protection, Jogar swung outward and downward with the chair he had lifted from the floor. All his remaining strength was in the swing. Wood crackled as Mendez's arms were battered downward. The bamboo was not heavy, but Joe had found power for his final chance. The Spaniard's arms swung loosely. His head fell sideways under the impact of the blow. He staggered back from the door, his eyes staring. And in a swift movement, Jogar had the door opened. Mendez struck at him weakly. The island detective had little power in the blow that caught the Spaniard on the right shoulder, spinning him around. But it knocked Mendez off balance. He plunged towards the open door. He was almost to his knees as his body angled beyond the plantation shack. The first shot crashed. There was a second, and then two more. Jogar stood motionless, listened to two more shots from the repeating rifle. Then there was silence, and later a crashing in the foliage below the shack. After a long minute, the island detective went outside and made certain that Mendez was dead. Then he went back into the room. It was all red with the rising sun. He sat in a chair for a few minutes. He got a package of Manila cigarettes from a pocket and lighted one. He thought of the woman, a man who was now dead had spoken about. 5 minutes later, when he stepped over the body of Mendez to leave the plantation shack, he did not look down. But as he went down the path towards the road, he muttered thickly. He did not lie about two things. The Chinese was waiting with his rifle, and the dawn was very red. End of Red Dawn by Ramon Decolta.